thank you all for coming today. I'm really excited to be here to talk with Sid Milkis and Dan Tichenor about their new book, Rivalry and Reform, Presidents, Social Movements, and the Transformation of American Politics. And I will say this now, and I will hopefully remember it at the very end as well. Afterwards, there are copies of the book available to buy out in the anteroom, and you can get them signed as well. So keep that in mind for afterwards.
By both of us.
It's a twofer. This is a book that I've now had the chance to read, and it's absolutely fascinating about the relationship between presidents and social movements. And it looks at some of the most important social movements in the last 150 years of American history, the relationship between Lincoln and the abolitionists, civil rights reformers and activists, and various presidents, including Lyndon Johnson, and Ronald Reagan and the Christian right. A really important social movement and presidential relationship that really reshaped one of the major parties. So these guys are going to get to talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes, but let me introduce them first. First of all, there is Sid Milkis, who is the White Burkett Miller Professor of Governance and Foreign Affairs. He's also a professor of politics here at UVA and an award-winning teacher here at UVA as well. He was a visiting professor of American government at Oxford University in the last year or so, and the author of really a long, long list of books and articles on the presidency, including The President and the Parties, Presidential Greatness, and Theodore Roosevelt, the Progressive Party, and the Transformation of American Democracy, which I think contains some of the seeds of some of the work he's doing here in this book. Sitting next to him is Dan Tichenor, the Philip H. Knight Chair of Political Science at the University of Oregon and Director of the Program on Democratic Engagement and Governance at the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics. He's an award-winning scholar of immigration and public policy and author of, among others, Dividing Lines, The Politics of Immigration Control. He's also the director of the Wayne Morse Scholars Program for students who are passionate about public affairs, and somewhat relatedly, studies the role of young people in democratic politics, including as activists, which hopefully is something that we can talk about today as well. So to kick us off, we are in a moment in which social movements seem to be thriving. I mean, in the last 10 years, we've seen the Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, movements for gun reform, for immigration rights. And we're also in a period in which the president looms large in our understanding of American politics. But I'm not sure that we often talk about those two political phenomena at the same time. So what led you both to put those two in conversation with one another?
I'll let you start.
Well, so both of us were struck by these two forces being incredibly impatient with the political status quo, each wanting to leave its mark on American politics in dramatic ways. And yet, so they share that in common. So in this Madisonian system with lots of brakes on significant change, they both are impatient with those forms of restraint. And yet they're so different in their orientation in many ways. And so for presidents, there's, in addition to, especially for modern presidents, to be agenda setters and leaving their mark and leaving their legacy, they also are expected to be keeping the order, to basically secure the social, political, and economic status quo in significant ways, whereas movements are typically going to be aggrieved with that very order and want to upend things as they exist. And so they each, basically want to produce change on their own terms, which creates then this, inevitable collision course for movements and presidents.
And so is that the idea behind Rivalry and Reform as the title?
Yeah, it's a important but excuse me, a fraught relationship in that a lot of presidents want to bring about fundamental change, and that's the very nature of social movements. But they have different ideas about, even if they're both committed to change, about how to do it. So presidents are constantly preaching patience because they don't want to destroy the possibility of a consensus forming behind this reform. And social activists don't like to be told to be patient. They want change as quickly as possible, and are particularly concerned about procedures and constitutional niceties in the way they pursue reform. And a lot of times presidents and social movements are at loggerheads, and presidents will repress social movements, like Andrew Jackson's suppression of the abolitionist movement, trying to squelch it. But from time to time, they need each other. And you'll get a president like Lincoln who thinks slavery is an evil, and you'll get an abolitionist movement that thinks slavery has to be abolished. But watching them come together in a common commitment to ending slavery is just fascinating. It's like watching a chess match or a romance. I mean, one of the titles we thought about in writing this book was Mating Dance, but we decided it was a little too salacious. Then we thought, Minuet? And we settled, I think it was Dan's idea to do Rivalry.
I was the killjoy about not making it Mating Dance because there's so much hostility, I think, especially, yeah, that's true.
You've had easier romances than that.
Didn't know we were going to go so deep so quickly.
Sorry.
Well, but let's talk about the abolitionist and about Lincoln, because as much as we now think about this as a very natural union between the two, that they were a perfect match right from the start, that's not actually the case. I mean, Lincoln was not an early adopter of the abolitionist cause. So why did abolitionists first look to Lincoln instead of, say, Congress or somebody else at the time? And how did that relationship develop into one where Lincoln would eventually become the great emancipator, which I think is not a title that he sought out early on?
You should jump in a second, but to me, to get us started on this, is what stands out is that for each of the movements that we highlight in the book, they're long social movements. That is, they don't start off abolitionist, Civil War, with significant leverage. You have to kind of, trace it over many decades of movements really, laboring in the wilderness and feeling very frustrated and dealing with lots of presidential indifference, because if presidents can avoid a movement, they often will. And so what you can see with each of the movements we talk about, especially with abolition, is how long they're basically toiling and not getting much result. And then, so fast forward to Lincoln, absolutely. I mean, what's striking is that you take someone like Frederick Douglass, who at the beginning of the war was, deeply frustrated, if not, harboring lots of acrimony towards Lincoln because he sees him as being, this consummate political pragmatist. Lincoln's really fulfilling the role of the president in trying to keep things together and to moderate these things. And for Douglass and so many others, they want to force the issue, right? And so that's where you have lots of activism that nudges along. Congress is an important part of this story. The Republican Party is an important part of the story. It's not just the president. And yet they focus so significantly on him. And I'm going to hand the baton, because I can keep going, but I want to.
Well, yeah, I mean, until the war breaks out, Lincoln argues that the federal government doesn't have the power to abolish slavery where it exists. But he feels slavery is an evil, but because he doesn't feel the federal government has the constitutional power to eliminate it. I mean, we forget the Constitution codified. We don't forget. Some may not recognize adequately the Constitution codifies slavery in some important ways. The fugitive slave law being a notorious example of that. So Lincoln, who was originally a Whig. And these Whig guys, they believe in in the Constitution and the rule of law and constitutional sobriety. And so Lincoln felt slavery was an evil, but the only thing you could do constitutionally was to keep it where it was, where the Missouri Compromise kept it, below the southern border of Missouri. And what makes Lincoln an interesting partner for the abolitionist movement is his opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. which repeals the Missouri Compromise and allows for the expansion of slavery. And then, of course, the Dred Scott decision, which says the federal government can't even prevent the expansion of slavery in the federal territory. So then he joins the emerging Republican Party, which is committed to preventing the expansion of slavery. And it's at that time that Lincoln comes out strongly arguing that slavery is an evil. It's a necessary evil because the Constitution protects it, but it must be kept where it is and thereby condemned to ultimate extinction. So it's only with the Civil War, when he feels like he has the prerogative that his Whig principles would deny him, that he begins to move towards emancipation. And that even takes forever.
Well, and that was going to be my question, is that, you know, the war starts, but Lincoln is not immediately out in front saying slavery is an absolute evil and we must abolish it, right?
Yeah.
How do abolitionists help push him in that direction? Or do they? Is it the war that pushes him there, or where do abolitionists fit in as activists?
Yeah, like they constantly pound the rock, both through action outside of the government, through demonstrations and petitions, and ceremonies where they burn the Constitution on July 4th, calling it a pact with the devil. As part of their effort for emancipation, and also through their influence in government, because there was an abolitionist wing of the Republican Party. Charles Sumner is probably the best example of that. They're constantly at Lincoln's ear, and Lincoln will occasionally have abolitionists to the executive mansion as well. But as Douglas said, we got to keep pounding the rock. We know his heart's in the right place, but he's a politician, and so to get him to do our bidding, we have to keep pressuring him.
And the pressure has both a militant and a more conciliatory face to it. So so for instance, you know, Sid was describing working with their allies in Congress who are more quietly engaging with, you know, in dialogue with Lincoln and how to handle various choices. But also, and having voices like Wendell Phillips and Frederick Douglass, who were one wing of the movement, but were willing to extend the olive branch at certain points, and then having other parts of the movement which are burning the Constitution and so forth. And so all those things, I think, really were significant in kind of creating more traction. And so when Lincoln's facing certain choices, the war is dictating some of those choices, but there are options at each of those junctures. So having these voices both within and without are really key in his thought process.
Yeah. And the other thing Lincoln is worried about is maintaining enough support in the North to fight the Civil War. And he's particularly worried about the border states. Like Kentucky is really important to Lincoln. So he's always saying, you know, he joined the abolitionists in saying slavery is the original sin of America, and so God is on our side. But even more than God, I need Kentucky. So another thing he's looking to the abolitionists for is, as they emerge as a thriving movement, is to change public opinion, in a sense, to give him the moral cover he needs to pursue slavery more aggressively than normal presidential politics will allow for.
So we see a lot of those same dynamics in another one of the major movements that you look at, which is the civil rights movement. That particular dynamic of you have people who are more perhaps radical or more extreme or want change more quickly, and then you have moderates. How does that relationship within the movement, the people who are pushing really hard and the people who are willing to conciliate, how does that work when it comes to the relationship between activists and the president?
So a good example of this is the tensions between the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee at key junctures in the narrative that we provide. So, for instance, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. there wasn't much of a mating dance a la Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers with Lyndon Johnson, but they clearly were willing to work together on certain things. And so when when Johnson could say, go out and make me do it, King could be sort of responsive in that way. But there was never love lost with the SCLC. I'm sorry, with SNCC. And so, in a sense, you had, coming from the more militant components of the movement, constant disruption that, in terms of protest and in terms of stinging critiques of the establishment, including the Johnson administration, that in a sense gave MLK and the SCLC more room to maneuver when they were talking to Johnson, because if you don't deal with us, you deal with them.
Yeah.
The fire next time.
Yeah. So paradoxically, we argue that the most successful movements are those that have both a more militant wing and a more pragmatic wing. And a lot of times, although you might think they're at loggerheads, and Martin Luther King did have very serious tensions with the black militant wing of the civil rights movement, particularly as it emerged in '65 and '66. But a lot of times they recognize the value of each other. They know they need each other to be a fully effective movement. So while you might think Stokely Carmichael, the leader, one of the founders of the black militancy wing of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King would be at loggerheads. They admired each other deeply and understood why both were going about their business the way they were. And that's kind of one of the, I think, the paradoxes of studying social movements. And social movements that only have one wing or the other tend to be less successful.
Mm-hmm.
There's also times where the compromises made by the more moderate elements of the movement are basically just anathema to other movement activists. So, for instance, the compromise made in '64 over the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was something that the younger activists who were out there registering people to vote and who made the sacrifices thought was ultimately untenable, that King and Johnson, King was willing to make these compromises with Johnson on something like that. And so that's like an ongoing tension that you can see over time, in which the younger activists just can't believe that their elders are willing to engage in these, basically sacrifice their ideals on the altar of political compromise.
And in fact, with the civil rights movement and Lyndon Johnson, those tensions ultimately resolve in the favor of SNCC and black militants and not in the favor of King, right? Why does it all break down so quickly? Because in '64, '65, it looks like the perfect marriage between the civil rights leaders and Lyndon Johnson. You get the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but by 1968, it's kind of a mess, right?
Yeah. I think one of the things is the scars left over from the compromise over the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party's challenge. The fact that Johnson, because he wanted to make sure that there was no disruption prior to the '64 election, particularly at the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, kind of forced a compromise that didn't really take on directly the lily white delegation from Mississippi that was under challenge from these Mississippi civil rights activists. And so there were scars left there, and that kind of generated some discontent and some militancy that moved away from Martin Luther King. What really made opened those sores to the point where the alliance broke down was the Vietnam War. By late '65, by the fall of 1965, Martin Luther King is even estranged from Johnson because of the Vietnam War. For two reasons, he argues. One, this is taking resources away from your war on poverty, a central part of Johnson's civil rights program. You're using it to fight this war in South Asia. And moreover, African Americans were disproportionately assuming the burden of fighting this war against communists in a civil war in Vietnam, when they felt they were in a feudal situation in the United States. So I think the combination of the scars left from this compromise in 1964 and then the Vietnam War really are the major causes that lead to the alienation between Johnson and the civil rights movement. And then there's this explosion, of course, of riots over 3 summers that really, really takes the civil rights movement in a direction that Johnson didn't anticipate and from which he suffered dramatically in terms of political support.
And really quickly, one other recurrent dimension of this is that presidents who engage in this reform with movements ultimately have this hope of harnessing the movement's energy, and that's, you know, a quixotic goal.
Right, the attempt to
Johnson may have wanted to do that larger, much more than other presidents in typical fashion, but I think almost every president situation hopes to somehow capture the energy of the movement, and of course they're elusive.
Well, I want to stick with the Vietnam War for a second, because we've talked about abolition and the civil rights movement and the way activists have partnered with presidents in order to get to reach their goals. The anti-war movement, on the other hand, had very little interest in partnering with Lyndon Johnson. He was in many ways the person that they were attacking. So maybe we could talk a little bit about the antagonism between activists and a president and how activists kind of make use of that. What does it look like when a powerful social movement isn't actually looking to necessarily woo a president, but is using that president as an object of scorn?
Yeah.
I mean, I think on foreign policy issues, you're most often going to find presidents in their nation-keeping role. And so the fact that movements are hardwired to, again, you know, upset the apple cart. On domestic policy, I think there's some more room to maneuver in terms of compromise, but when they're attacking a president's national security policy, much less so. And so hence, I think it's going to kind of draw out kind of these, as you say, the antagonistic components of that relationship all the more dramatic. So even when things when you have forms of a collaboration that produce change that both presidents and movements can agree upon, there's still something uneasy about the relationship. And so when you're describing the late 60s with the civil rights movement, it's almost inevitable that things are going to come undone. This is not going to be a long time relationship. What you're pointing out, I think, really aptly with something like the Vietnam War is that there's also plenty of causes in which movements are not going to want the president to be hand in hand helping them. In fact, the president is the cause of the grievance that they want to challenge. I don't know.
No.
Yeah, well, the reason that I wanted to ask that question is because so many of the social movements of late, right? If we think about the Tea Party and how antagonistic it was toward the Obama administration, or the Me Too movement and its relationship to the Trump administration, it's interesting to think about the much different relationship between social movements when they've turned the president into a very different kind of actor who they're not looking necessarily for gains.
And the conflict between Johnson and the anti-war movement was particularly poignant because, remember, the anti-war movement comes right out of the civil rights movement. And so these are the people who Johnson had courted and felt that he had collaborated with to the great benefit of both and passed 3 really important pieces of legislation: the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act, the 68 Fair Housing Act. And then he felt betrayed. It was almost like it wasn't like the resistance movement going after Trump. They know they are enemies. Here, Johnson was like King Lear. You know, it was his own family, so to speak, that had turned on him. And I think that was a particularly devastating thing for Johnson to experience. It made it hard for him to fight back, and I think it's one of the reasons he decided not to run for re-election. I mean, I'm old, so I remember sitting there watching television on March 31st, 1968, and Johnson's going to make a speech, and my dad and I, who argued all the time about Vietnam, decided we'd watch it together and see how our dispute could be carried on or modified by whatever Johnson was going to say. And I'll tell you, when Johnson said that he was not going to run for re-election, well, it wasn't re-election because he had been He had ascended to the office when Kennedy died, but when he was not going to run for election in '68, we were, for all our disagreements about Johnson, we were both flabbergasted. So that relationship, I think, Nikki, shows particularly well the tensions between presidents and social movements. Presidents bring into this relationship responsibilities like foreign policy, as Dan was saying, that when they cut against the commitments and causes of a social movement, will arouse opposition to them. But Johnson felt he had, particularly when he thought about what had happened with Truman, when China went communist, Johnson felt that was a moment that was in his head when he expanded our involvement in Vietnam. He felt he had no recourse to take a strong command of the Vietnam situation. That's a president's job. But for social movements, their job is to advance their causes, and the Vietnam War to them violated their causes at home and violated their understanding of imperialism abroad.
So if we would have the greatest truth in advertising, the font on our book would have Rivalry in large, 20-size font. Then you'd have Reform a little bit smaller.
Yeah.
Not really, really small, but smaller.
Yeah, but in bold colors, because when the stars align,
Yeah.
when this fraught but potentially formative relationship comes through, we have the most dramatic changes in our democracy in American history. So even though see this is the fun about co-authors. We have these ongoing little pictures. So Dan writes about the rivalry. I like the Reform. So even though the Reform will be smaller, it's going to be in bolder colors.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and
I'll buy that.
one other place where that marriage really works out in a lot of ways, especially for the activists, is with Ronald Reagan and the religious right.
Yeah.
Now, the religious right had a very different strategy in some ways from the civil rights activists that we've been talking about. How does it look different when the Christian right gets into the game?
Yeah. Great question.
So first of all, they aren't as disruptive in the same ways as we discuss a number of other movements, in the sense of, there's not, there are speeches and protests and so forth, but it's not of the magnitude that we're talking about with the bus boycotts and the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and so forth. That movement was much stronger in developing, especially from the late 70s onward, a very insider party-based strategy, a get out the vote strategy, an approach that was emphasizing kind of mainstream politics. And so you could have things, if you go, especially earlier in the 70s and so forth, you could have, for instance, the West Virginia textbook insurgency and things like that, which, look more like typical social movements, but for the new Christian right, there was a fusion with a number of key Republican New Right strategists that from the very start, when the moral majority is being created, for instance, there's a lot of careful thinking about what kind of mass advertising campaign do we want to launch, which candidate of the Republican Party are we going to endorse, and so forth. And so in that sense, it was kind of a strikingly different orientation that hewed much closer to conventional American politics. So they had these insurgent, slightly disruptive components, but on a much lower level than the other movements that we discuss.
I mean, one of the things I found interesting in studying Reagan and the Christian right was to see, and this is slightly oversimplifying, but to see that conservatives, when they become active, are still conservative. So the Christian right, once they settled on Reagan, which is an interesting story in and of itself, but once they decided on Reagan and he wooed them, I mean, that was an interesting, I'll call it a chess game. But once they settled on Reagan, there was a reverence for him and for the presidency that was hard to move away from. So even when the Christian right got a little impatient with Reagan, because he was pushing tax cuts and and foreign policy much more than he was focusing on abortion policy, the right to life and so forth. They wouldn't go after him in the way the civil rights activists would go after Lyndon Johnson. And they had reverence for him and for the role of America as an exceptional nation abroad. Now, part of this is their Christian values. So the battle against godless communism meant a whole lot to the Christian, the Christian right. But the way they helped Reagan fend off the nuclear freeze movement, as he was trying to move away from détente and take a stronger stand against the evil empire, I think is really indicative of what a relationship between a conservative social movement and a president looks like. It looks very different from what we observed with Lincoln and the Abolitionists and Johnson and the civil rights movement. It's also interesting that that Reagan saw the Christian right as a way of infusing the anti-communist position in the United States, kind of away from realpolitik towards a more messianic position, a more religious position. And so the famous Evil Empire speech is a speech he gives to conservative Christians. And if you watch that speech, I showed it to my students the other day, and they were both entertained and horrified by the intense religiosity of that meeting. And some of the coverage was, oh my God, we're breaking down the barriers between the church and the state with Reagan developing such a strong relationship with the Christian right in international affairs. But I think much of this is part and parcel of of the complexity of conservative activism. It's almost an oxymoron, but it's not like they didn't try to persuade Reagan to move in a certain direction, but it's done with much more reverence, I think, than is the case.
Just to amplify this case comes closest to Sid's mating dance, in the sense that let me give an example of this. So when a key point during the 1980 election, Reagan flies down to Dallas, Texas, for a key gathering of various evangelists, and they have already decided, they've crossed off the list John Connally, who was originally on it, but then they turned against him, and that's a whole other story. But where this story is particularly germane to the cozier relationship between this president and this movement is, as Reagan is riding in the limo to the event, James Robeson, who was acting as the key MC televangelist at this gathering, is basically suggesting to then candidate Reagan various lines he might use when he addresses folks. And he says, now, Governor Reagan, remember that we're supposed to be a nonpartisan body. We cannot endorse any candidate. And he suggests to Reagan this line that sets evangelists afire. And that is, he said, I think you should tell them that while you can't endorse me, I can endorse you. And that becomes the famous line where he then shows up at the event. And the other thing that's sort of striking about this is that basically his careful handlers, Deaver and Meese and so forth, are like, stay off stage. Robeson is he's eccentric when he's out there.
He's a fire breather.
And so you don't want the major network news to catch you, on stage with him. And Reagan actually doesn't follow their orders, pulls a chair out and sits on stage and nods approvingly during this. And so a lot of the evangelists who were there and those who were watching noted that he was, in a sense, non-verbally giving sanction to what Robeson was saying. And then he delivers the famous line, and everyone in unison in the hall stands up and gives a standing ovation. And it's a dramatic example of, one would not expect MLK to be giving a line to LBJ, even though they did consult on speeches and various things. And so it was a different kind of relationship. The other thing that I would point out that I think is also really striking, that kind of sets this one apart from the abolitionists and the civil rights activists and other movements we discuss, is how much Reagan's hand out to the movement and bringing them into the White House mattered for such a significant portion of Christian right activists. The one word that comes up over and over again in interviews and so forth is recognition. So there was certainly a significant portion of the religious right who were frustrated with Reagan on various policy initiatives, but an even larger portion said he gave us respect, he gave us recognition, which was really critical for particularly movement activists who, remember, the Christian right had been in the political wilderness, at least in scopes and so forth. So even though we had Billy Graham and some others, a majority of Christian fundamentalists felt like they were basically at the margins of American politics. So.
And weren't even sure they could find a place in the two parties, and they're thinking about, well, maybe we'll form a third party. And for a while they were infatuated with Jimmy Carter because he was a born-again Christian. But because of this, the consummation of this mating dance between Reagan and the Christian right, they became the foot soldiers. They became the grassroots mobilizers of the Republican Party, and they're still at the center of the Republican Party. And we can see that just looking at the Supreme Court nominations that President Trump has made.
Well, and it strikes me that one of the commonalities between the Reagan Religious Right Union and the LBJ Civil Rights Union is that those presidents' decisions to partner or work with those social movements both fundamentally transform those parties.
Yeah.
There's something incredibly consequential to presidents choosing these relationships.
Yeah. I mean, even though Lyndon Johnson and the civil rights movement had a falling out, and he was in a way sacrificed by the anti-war movement, the nomination of George McGovern in 1972 marked a major transformation of the Democratic Party. And what a party that was once anchored by labor unions and economic issues was now anchored by social activists and the social issues that became so central to the 60s and 70s and are still at the foundation of the post-60s Democratic Party. And in a way, when I was, one of the things Dan and I do, it's really fun to write the book, but before you write the book, you got to spend a lot of mind-numbing hours in archives finding evidence. They're fun every about hour. You come across some, you go through mind-numbing. But one of the things I found was that McGovern went to see Johnson in 1965, I think, and told him, and this before the Vietnam War really became controversial and polarized the country. Said, Mr. President, this war is going to destroy your great society. And Johnson, in typical Johnson confidence, said, no, it won't, George. I'll find a way to dedicate, to both take care of the war and continue the great society. No, he said, I think it's going to destroy it. And so it's in a sense, when George McGovern, the baton is passed on to him, then the party becomes more shaped by the ideas of the Great Society, which Johnson was dedicated to, but Johnson couldn't take him to the promised land because he still had some of these old Cold War commitments. He had to start during the Roosevelt administration, still had a lot of commitment to that period of the Democratic Party, but George McGovern took me. By the way, when I wrote that, the head of the LBJ library said that was a false document. You're making this up, Milkis. This is false. This is fake news. and I said, well, do some checking, talk to some people. And he found out that I was right, that the piece of paper was there.
So in terms of, as you described, as consequential in terms of what's happening with movements and presidents and parties, one of the stories we tell is that as during the last quarter century is, a kind of dramatic iteration of presidential prerogatives, party polarization, and movement insurgency that get fused in ways that have dramatic implications in terms of our politics. And so if you look over the course of what we describe over the course of American history, lots of clashes and occasional alignments of these movements and presidents. but that what we describe is almost an institutionalization of those three components. That is the presidential discretion, the partisan polarization, and movement insurgency that really has a transformational effect and is more of a constancy in our politics in significant ways. And so our two most recent presidents also envision themselves as kind of leading presidential movements in different ways, but Obama and Trump speak of kind of being at the van of a presidential movement, when in fact those aren't the same as genuine movements. And in fact, there's significant clashes, for instance, for Obama between he and a number of more genuine movements within his own alignment.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about Obama because here's somebody who comes into the presidency as a community organizer. He is probably the president with the most social movement background that we've had, and did see himself as the head of a social movement, and in fact starts up Obama for America, or Organizing for America, and this group that's trying to translate his presidency into social activism, or creating that kind of very tight bond, and is continuing to do that with his presidential library. But social movement activists don't necessarily love Obama and his presidency. Why didn't that translate into a closer and more effective set of relationships? Or did it, and am I mischaracterizing it?
No, there was a considerable tension between Johnson. I'm sorry. When you rifle through history, there was tension between Lincoln and the LGBTQ movement. Yeah, there was tension between Obama and the LGBTQ movement and the immigration rights movement and Black Lives Matter movement. Even though he was a community organizer, even though he saw himself as kind of representing the maturing of the Great Society Coalition, even though he formed an organization which he saw as the vanguard of his movement, Organizing for Action, as you mentioned, which is really a fascinating information age grassroots organization. But if you talk to social activists, what they'll tell you is Obama, the community organizer, could be a social activist. Obama, the president, cannot be. So there are these very powerful vantage point consequences. When you're president, you simply cannot be an activist. You can be sympathetic to the cause of immigration rights groups and LGBTQ groups. And Johnson would constantly tell them, make me do it. I want to do it, but you got to make me do it. You got to do your work on the ground, and then I'll evolve and I'll support same-sex marriage. But I can't do it unless you do your part to build the foundation for me to make that politically consequential decision. And social activists, as much as they liked Obama and as much as they admired his past, knew that he was president and knew that they had to pound him. They had to keep pressure on him. And if they didn't do that, as much as he was sympathetic with their cause, he would not support their cause. I mean, just watching Obama go through that evolution towards his acceptance from a rejection to an acceptance of same-sex marriage is no less tortuous than watching Lincoln's move to Canaan, as Frederick Douglass put it, in his movement towards the Emancipation Proclamation. Both were halting, both were worried about maintaining a national consensus, both were worried about getting reelected. So part of it, I think, is institutional, the institutional differences, and how powerful they are.
So the danger when there's co-authors is that you get to hear two of us say the same thing, so in echoes. But Ta-Nehisi Coates had a great reflection on exactly this point where he said that, yes, Obama was a community organizer, but he was never a protester.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
And I think that captures a lot.
Yeah.
So, for instance, around immigration reform, there was deep anger for young activists, the Dreamers and others, who were incredibly outraged that Obama had not made comprehensive immigration reform, in their view, a top issue from day one, that he put healthcare and other things ahead of time. And also were out protesting, describing him as the deporter-in-chief. From his perspective as president, and David might be able to speak to this in a moment, but as president was able, was concerned with trying to build up the bona fides for comprehensive immigration reform, showing that he was in fact going to enforce as well as finding a path to legalization and so forth. So he was trying to be the consensus builder. He was trying to be a pragmatist about this. But for those young dreamers, it seemed that he had betrayed them. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is in White House gatherings on this, where it was just the immigrant rights folks and the president and his staffers on this, the older immigrant rights advocates were counseling their younger counterparts to be patient. Sound familiar? We were just talking about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and SNCC, the younger civil rights activists, a very similar dynamic. And what's striking is that those young activists didn't give up. And in fact, after one of these meetings, there's the bank of cameras and microphones, and those who were present walked out, and everyone was supposed to be kind of following a careful script of, we know the president's with us. And all of the more seasoned advocates, basically followed the script to a T. And then one of the younger dreamers basically went off on him. And that kind of captures this difference. She was a protester. Mm-hmm. She wasn't concerned about the consensus he was trying to build. And ultimately, they later, so this is like during the early stages, it goes back to just describing Lincoln and abolition, why it takes a while. At these early stages, they were at loggerheads. Over time, they get the president team and a number of kind of outside lawyers begin to come together around deferred action for childhood arrivals, DACA, in 2012. And there's a long story about that, and Marco Rubio and so forth. But cutting to the chase, when you fast forward into Obama's second term, many of those young activists actually had started to form a working relationship with him, and there was more respect. So in the same way that Frederick Douglass only over time begins to understand what he described initially as the cold tardiness of Lincoln on this issue, begins to understand, he's trying to be a statesman, he's got to bring others along. So I think that speaks to the heart of this.
Yeah, and when he issued the second immigration order for undocumented parents of permanent residents and citizens, which was actually involved a lot more people than DACA, something like 5 million people, and then it was held up by the courts. That's where the relationship was really sealed. Yeah. And then he had, after the courts challenged it, he had them all to the White House and told them, "I'm going to fight the court's resistance." They all came out as they did in the earlier press conference, but they were joined this time by the more militant members of the immigration rights organization who said, "God, this is one of these rare moments in history where the president and social activists are of one mind." So a lot of times these stories, the long playing out of the relationship between the present social movements has this kind of happy ending or an ending where there is a joining of the minds and the political wills. But what's been fascinating to Dan and myself is how is the intrigue and the complexity of that path over time. And again, a lot of times it doesn't work out, and they become estranged.
I was just going to say really quickly that it's also that this example of the Dreamers gives a great case of when kind of the disruption of politics outdoors can move to mainstream politics indoors. So one of these key Dreamer activists at the time, who was leading the Deporter-in-Chief protests and so forth, later becomes candidate Hillary Clinton's point person within the campaign organization on Latino outreach. And so she had shifted from purely protest politics to being in the, having a seat at the table and being involved in very much the conventional nature of American electoral politics.
She gave a primetime address at the Democratic National Convention.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I'm so struck by, and maybe this is the power of social activism, is that many of the people that you write about in the book that you're talking about now are people outside of the circle of people with full citizen rights, whether it's enslaved people or whether it's undocumented immigrants or whether it's women before suffrage or whether it's children who are working for gun rights. Is is there a difference in the kind of relationship that activists have with the president depending on whether they're voters or not, or whether they're full citizens or not?
Great question. Do you want to go first? So my gut says that
He didn't give me much of a chance, you know.
well, because I actually have a lot to say on it, and I'm worried. It's actually the reverse.
Before you launched, you wanted to give me a chance.
So I'll try to do a really short version, which is
This is the Tichenor filibuster.
there we go. It'll be quick. Which is that what was striking to us, for instance, when we were comparing the new Christian right with the civil rights movement, and so is, we expected to find very significant differences in what the grievances were. And in fact, substantively, they're there. But what stands out is how often we found among the Christian right activists a sense of disenfranchisement, or actually of marginalization. So it's not exactly, it's not the same thing as, facing Jim Crow. It's not the same thing as, women lacking the vote. It's not the same thing as immigrants living in the shadows and hoping that they can gain membership. But from their perspective, what we saw again and again is that they didn't feel like they were full, counted on, respected members of the political community. So actually what strikes me is how much resonance there was across it. So I don't know if you agree, but that was something that really stood out to me.
Yeah, and to go back to the 19th century for a second, one of the most interesting things to me in doing the research on the abolitionists with Dan was how active women were in the abolitionist movement, and many women who were leaders of the suffragist movement, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, were really active in the abolitionist movement. And they, even though a lot of the men in the abolitionist movement tried to keep them out, and there was a lot of friction over their playing such an important role, but they said, we're natural for this role, because we really understand what it means not to be a citizen with a full share. And we don't have the ballot or the bullet either. And so we can engage, we understand this kind of social activism, petitions, demonstrations, and so forth, in the fight for full citizenship. They were really very important. I mean, they even were central to getting Lincoln to give the Gettysburg Address. I mean, we can document that. I always thought, well, Lincoln decided he'd give the Gettysburg Address. But this came after months of appeal from these women abolitionists that what we needed now from the president was really less military force than a statement of principles telling us the role of the Declaration in America's political tradition. And so I think, again, this goes to your point about how the being excluded, feeling like you're marginalized, feeling that you don't have citizenship with a full share, really is an important incentive in bringing you into this kind of social activism.
Yeah, and I think there's also a very crass political calculation for a number of these movements in targeting the presidency as well. So Alice Paul, since you invoked the suffragists, she looks at the presidency post Theodore Roosevelt and says, she hasn't, first of all, Theodore Roosevelt was not exactly someone who she considered on her side in the fight for women's suffrage, but she looked at the office and said, he has infused it with an energy that we need to get done what we need to get done. And what she meant by that is that all the constitutional structural veto points make it so maddening for a reformer like her to basically overcome all of these insurmountable barriers and so forth. But she thought the presidency might be a crucial energy source. Moreover, the bully pulpit, in the way that she saw the popular rhetorical presidency evolving, could serve as something that could grant legitimacy and recognition. And so she was no presidentialist. She wasn't reifying the office, and she certainly was not in love with either Theodore Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson by any means, who she saw as opponents to her cause. But she saw the institution and what was being created in terms of power and authority in that office as an opportunity point for she and her movement. I think so many of the individuals and movements who we chronicle in the book have that similar perspective, especially over time.
Right, and that is something that changes over time in the book, which is so
Right.
impressive, which is
Yeah.
that not just the symbolism of the presidency changes, but actually the scope of powers in the executive branch changes so much.
And once that happens, the presidency can't be ignored. In the 19th century, other than Lincoln, the presidency wasn't so central to social activists. But in the 20th century, you either have to get them on your side or you have to resist them. But they cannot be ignored. The civil rights movement felt they hated Wilson, Woodrow Wilson. He had extended Jim Crow to the federal civil service. An unbelievable blow to the development of the rights of African Americans. But they needed him to denounce this movie, Birth of a Nation, particularly since he had screened it in the White House. Mm-hmm. And they stalked him for 2 years, with demonstrations, petitions, and they finally persuaded him to denounce Birth of a Nation. And they felt they had no recourse because his voice was so important to the country.
And this actually circles back in some ways to one of your earlier questions about the anti-Vietnam War protests and other examples where the president is the object of scorn. It's why we think it's so important in understanding this critical relationship in American history to look at the long social movements, because you can basically early on, presidents often will serve more as a foil rather than somebody who's a collaborator with them. And for Du Bois, Wilson serves as exactly that kind of foil to help launch the long civil rights movement, at least in his mind.
I want to ask you one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So if you have your questions, get them ready. But one thing that I keep going back to is it seems like there is a development for many social movements of moving from playing both parties to focusing on just one. You see it in the civil rights movement to an extent, you see it in the feminist movement, you see it with the Christian right, you see it in many ways with the NRA and the gun rights movement, that there is a narrowing that happens. And is that a consequence of figuring out your strategy, or is that a consequence of an increasingly polarized political realm?
I would say the latter. The increasingly polarized political realm, some of which social movements contributed to. So we talked about how the civil rights movement had transformed the Democratic Party, and the Christian right had transformed the Republican Party. And what we've seen are also institutional reforms which came out of the anti-war movement, like the McGovern and Fraser reforms, which put in the primary system, which have weakened party organizations, made them more porous, made them more susceptible to insurgency. So I think the combination of the institutional reforms and the cultural and social explosions that came out of the 60s have really led to this joining that Dan talked about before of presidential prerogative, partisan polarization, and social activism, and that's a very combustible combination.
And I know we want to turn to questions. So the really quick thought on this is simply that. It also kind of raises an interesting question whether that partisan kind of targeting a particular party or being an anchor for a particular party by a movement helps or hurts them in the long run. And it kind of depends when you're looking at the situation. So at times you could look at it and say, well, there's co-optation that can occur. Many in the religious right felt that, when they got to the end of the Reagan years, they got the recognition, but when they looked at the policy achievements, they weren't so thrilled. And then mounted a systematic strategy to basically put people in office at every level and every institution or every branch of our government. And so, they now have significant leverage in the Republican Party. It's an interesting question. Clearly, they feel like there's more consequence to that alignment with the party today than in, circa '88. But when a Democrat's in office, what does that mean? And we can flip that around as well to movements, the labor movement, civil rights, and so forth, when their party's not in power.
So just a very quick follow-up. What do you think is going to happen with immigration? Because until recently, immigrant rights groups were very much working with both Republicans and Democrats. Do you see that same winnowing process happening, or do you think that it'll continue to be a bipartisan movement?
It's not bipartisan right now. I think it now. If you look at the recent platforms and delegates and voting and so forth, it is now smack dab in the middle of our polarization.
Yeah.
The middle is the wrong way to put it. It is. You can make predictions of where candidates for office are likely to stand on not just questions of undocumented immigrants, but now also legal immigration, refugees, and so forth. By what party goes with their name. And as you say, for long swaths of our history, it was very much a bipartisan issue. And I tend to be an inveterate optimist, so I think there's actually lots of room for a bipartisan approach to come back in, but under the current administration, not likely.
Well, let's open it up. There's a microphone in the back, so if you will start up here, and if you'll just wait for the microphone so they can hear you on the TV. Let's start here, and then we'll come.
First of all, I want to thank all three of you for an outstanding, scholarly, and non-ideological presentation.
Does that mean boring?
No, not enlightening.
I was just kidding.
Going to Lincoln and the Abolitionists, how influential were the literary giants on Lincoln and the Abolitionists at the time? I think pretty much all of them were for it, or at least sympathetic towards it, maybe with the exception of Hawthorne. I think when John Brown was hanged, he said he got what he deserved, but quite a few of the other ones, like Emerson and Thoreau and the other ones, a lot of them saw it sort of like as the second crucifixion. So how much of their thought influenced abolitionists in general, like Garrison and Douglas, and how much of it influenced Lincoln?
Yeah, that's a great question.
As we both look at each other.
Yeah. I didn't do enough research. It's too bad.
It makes me want to read more.
It makes me want to
read
write
your book on
Yeah,
this.
it makes me want to do a second edition. Yeah, I mean, clearly the Transcendentalists were really important to both the abolitionists and Lincoln. And this idea which Douglas had first, that the Declaration of Independence was a transcendent document, and that the Declaration was the North Star, and the Constitution was the means by which you got to the fulfillment of the principles. And this notion that the Union had this organic connection to the Declaration, that comes out of the Transcendentalist movement, and it influences Frederick Douglass, and it greatly influences Lincoln, because before this there was this notion that the kind of partisans of the Constitution, partisans of the Declaration. So Calhoun defends the Constitution. There's no statement about inalienable rights in this Constitution. And then people like Jefferson defending the Declaration. And the Transcendentalists who influenced the abolitionists in Lincoln begin to bring those two together. The whole idea of a living Constitution, I think, comes out of some of this great literature of the 1900s.
And I remember in some of the correspondence between...
1800s, I'm sorry.
I was going to say...
It's flying through the centuries.
I seem to, in some of the correspondence between Wendell Phillips and Charles Sumner, they'll be talking about something with, surrounding the ending slavery, and then there'll be some references to the literature. But I'm not remembering much with Phillips and Douglas, and but that said, we were going in with our fishing nets, and we were, we probably let some things go through the holes. Yeah. But that's really fascinating.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, my question's about Lincoln, too, and the timing of the Emancipation Proclamation. He's thinking, whether what was going on in the war gave him the cover to do it then, or he's cynically thinking, hey, I need 170,000 more men. Why don't I just free all these guys and take them on my side? And, what was really going through his head? Was he really talking about emancipation, or was he really talking about, hey, I need some more soldiers?
Well, I love Richard Hofstadter's phrasing of this, where he said the Emancipation Proclamation had all the passion of a bill of lading. And in that sense, he was describing it very much an instrumental act meant as a war measure. But what also stands out is how much it electrified abolitionists, and how much they saw this as, at such a critical inflection point. And so, in the book you'll find lots of exuberant quotes from folks who had, prior to this, been deep cynics of Lincoln, so like Douglas and others who all of a sudden are embracing him and understanding, okay, now he's on our side. We still need to push him, but we've got an ally. So as I read the historical record, I can find, if we had 2 columns, I could find evidence I could give you on either one of those.
I think they come together. I mean, Lincoln, again, this Whig, felt that you could only do the Emancipation Proclamation as a matter of war necessity, it really wasn't. You couldn't emancipate slaves through an executive order. Only a dictator could do that. You would need a constitutional amendment, which Lincoln would work for later. But I think Lincoln saw the Emancipation Proclamation as a first step that would make inevitable a movement to something like the 13th Amendment. And he gave it some moral lift when he kept telling people, I need a sign from God before we do this. We need to win a battle. we need to win a battle. And this is an odd thing for Lincoln to say because he had unconventional views on religion. But what he's embracing here is the abolitionist view, which is growing in the country, that slavery is a sin. And so he needs a sign from God to begin the step of getting rid of this. This is the language of the abolitionists. So I think Lincoln saying that, maybe, I don't think it was completely calculated because I do think he had a lot of deep feeling about slavery. He had a view. He couldn't go about it as an abolitionist, but he had deep feeling about it. But I think the Emancipation Proclamation, although it reads as a bill of lading, it so exhilarates the abolitionists because they know Lincoln's on his way to the promised land now. There's no turning back.
Thank you. I'd like to just turn the question to who gains and who loses. What was the motivation? And I'll give you my view on 2 and you tell me what you think. I see Lyndon Johnson as a convert to something that he didn't come from and that he thought and said might destroy him. And that was civil rights from a Southern Democrat who was the protege of Richard Russell. This was a big change. So he comes to this truly convinced by the civil rights movement, by MLK, and even before MLK. On the opposite is Reagan. Reagan needed the evangelists, and so he went about getting them, and as you said, did it very overtly. There was nothing subtle in that. So when you consider this, how does that difference come up? How much of it is, I'm going to use the movement, or the movement has convinced me and I'm going to facilitate what they did?
Great question.
Yeah.
I wish we had all you guys as co-authors.
I know. Or as our reviewers. And we get
No, not reviewers. They're too smart to be reviewers. We'd be still working. We'd be still working on the book. I'll just take a crack at Johnson. I think Johnson is such a complex person. I mean, he's really worthy of Shakespearean treatment. That's why the King Lear analogy I like. And I don't think his calculation was as political as Reagan's. I mean, Reagan is a principled conservative, but he was a party builder. I think Johnson, particularly after his experience in the South and filibustering against civil rights, and he felt liberated when he finally got to national office, saying, I've been kissing ass my whole life, but I don't have to kiss ass anymore. I think there was this thing about Johnson that this is my way to make my mark on history. And this is risky politically. I don't know if I can't find the smoking gun that he ever said when he signed the Civil Rights Bill that I've just lost the South. And people tell me he was worried about, he thought it was a possibility. He thought without Vietnam and a good economy, he might have avoided the South leaving the Democratic Party. But to a man and woman, the people who work with Johnson told me he would have done it anyway, that it was worth the short-term loss of political support to what he to satisfy his enormous ambition. He wanted to be famous. He wanted to be the best president of them all. He wanted to out Roosevelt. You know, he wasn't happy about the '64 election, even though it was obvious he'd won a landslide from the first minute the polls closed, until he was sure that he had bested Roosevelt's performance in 1936 as the best popular vote. So I think that's a fascinating observation, and they're very different in the way they go about this alliance.
Yeah, and I think that sounds, right on. I would just add, though, what's interesting. So I think you have Reagan exactly right, and there's a lot of calculation and far more than LBJ is thinking about how do I build a certain kind of party with a certain kind of coalition and so forth. That said, there are key conservative right leaders who feel that Reagan really has common cause with them. Now, I don't know, because I can't divine what was in Reagan's head. It may be that he was a better actor. But for those leaders of evangelical leaders of the movement, they felt actually that his heart and mind was with them. So there's no question that the pragmatism was there for him, but he convinced them that something else was also part of the chemistry. Yeah.
I'm not sure whether you deal with the temperance movement at any point during your book, but it seems to be a fascinating subject, if only because the movement essentially collapsed almost immediately after the legislation was enacted. Perhaps you could talk to that movement for a moment?
Yeah. You know more about those.
Yeah, well, and he and I might, this is when, you can pass it off to your co-author if you don't have a good answer. So there was a time where we were thinking about, because we clearly in the book wanted to spend some time talking about not just movements of the left, but also movements of the right, and the Christian right fit beautifully within this. There was a time when we were thinking about the temperance movement at some length, and especially as a pietistic one and so forth, and fascinating, because also a long movement, right? You can go from the early 19th century and on. We ultimately decided no, because presidents we found were far less consequential than other institutions and actors in our system. Mm-hmm. So on that one, we found that the executives really were not making a huge difference on this. And once there was a fait accompli, they might give their imprimatur on a few issues, but they were not as significant in that process by our reading. So I guess that's what stands out for me.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I wonder if this absence of kind of the institutional part of the story that are central to our case studies is one of the reasons why the Prohibition Amendment is reversed so quickly. I mean, everybody talks about how remarkable it was we got this Prohibition movement, and it is remarkable. But isn't it amazing we got rid of it so quickly? What a renunciation. I still think that a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on the New Deal and Social Security. I think FDR is proclaiming that the bars are open is an underestimated cause of his popularity.
My grandparents met at a speakeasy, so I'm very grateful for Prohibition personally. So.
You've not talked about FDR and the changes that came about during his 4 terms. Why?
Well, the short answer is he's in the book. We just didn't talk about him today. And I'll get it rolling and then hand off to Sid. I mean, one of the things that's absolutely critical in our coverage of the civil rights movement, for instance, is thinking about Franklin Roosevelt's kind of critical role at a key stage of the civil rights movement in this process. And one of the things that we talk about at length is the effort of A. Philip Randolph to pressure FDR during the war when he accurately perceived his leverage would be at its zenith. And that's where you get the origins of the March on Washington, which you probably know a fair amount of that story. And so that's one moment where we spent a lot of time talking about FDR. He also comes up with the Christian right for us because we have account, a kind of extensive account, dealing with conservative evangelicals who are hostile to this kind of socialist devil in the White House, who they see as a significant threat, and who they see as actually, not in keeping with the gospel as they understand it. And so, in any case, so FDR plays a part in each of the cases that we talk, well, not abolition, but with a lot of the other movements.
Yeah.
A little bit, not as much.
Well, she's always there with civil rights. So when A. Philip Randolph is trying to get Roosevelt to issue an executive order that would end segregation in the armament industry, this arsenal of democracy that he was mobilizing as we moved towards World War I, this was happening at the beginning of 1941. A. Philip Randolph, this great civil rights activist who was also a great union leader, tried to persuade Roosevelt to issue it, and he couldn't get anywhere. So then he went to Eleanor, figuring that he could get her to work on Franklin. That didn't work either, frankly. Eleanor was not quite as progressive as she's made out to be. She was just as political as her husband. So then he builds this tremendous network around the country, with the beginning of the March on Washington movement says, issue the executive order, 100,000 people are going to march on Washington. And they went back and forth on this for a while. And finally, Roosevelt blinked. And this is a key moment for us because this is the first time clearly where a social movement targets a president and gets that president to do something the president did not want to do, clearly did not want to do. And that's what political scientists call power, getting someone to do something they do not want to do. So this is a key juncture for us in the book. Now, we could have focused on unions, of course, but Dan and I made a decision at the beginning of this project that we wanted to look at race and religion, that these somehow were the fault lines of American politics, even more than economics. And so we didn't focus as much on FDR and unions as we did on his relationship with the civil rights movement.
And just to bring it full,
and the Christian movement.
Just to bring it full circle, after Sid and I finished some interviews with a number of kind of key leaders of the Dreamer movement, they sent us an email. One of them sent us an email after, can you tell me everything you know about A. Philip Randolph? Yeah. Because the president keeps telling us we have to do what A. Philip Randolph did. So,
we did.
Yeah. So.
And then they went to Obama and said, we did what you told us to do. We did what A. Philip Randolph did. Now issue that executive order. This is all true.
All right, well, you can read all about that in Rivalry and Reform, which is available for you in the lobby. But first, please help me in both thanking and congratulating Dan and Sid on their new book.
Thank you. Thank you. Great job. Thank you.
And let's please thank